You ever ask somebody how their day was or how work was, and they just answer with one word? Busy. Not good, not bad, not clear. Busy. It's the safest answer we have. Busy means you were needed. Busy means you didn't waste any time. Busy means you were moving, and movement feels productive. You answered your emails, you jumped into red lines, you fixed things, you crossed items off a list, you didn't stop, and that feels like success. I used to say busy with a little bit of pride, like it proves something, and like the pace itself meant I was doing the right work. And I didn't question it because why would I? Everything around me rewarded it. But here's the thing I didn't notice at the time: being busy kept me from noticing I didn't know where I was going. Because when you're moving constantly, you don't look up. You don't check orientation. You don't ask whether the thing you're working on is actually the thing that matters right now. You just keep going. And that's the quiet trap. Movement feels productive, but movement is not always progress. You can move all day and still end up in the same spot. You can stay busy and still miss the point. You can work hard, but still work on the wrong things. Most people aren't overwhelmed because there's too much work. They're overwhelmed because their effort isn't pointed in the right direction. And no one really teaches you how to tell the difference. You're listening to The Practice of Practice, a podcast for architects, designers, and emerging professionals navigating the gap between school and real work. We focus on the realities most people only learn through experience: workflow, judgment, responsibility, and time. It's not theory, it's practice. Before we get into this and go any further, I want to say this clearly. If this feels familiar, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing exactly what the system trained you to do. Practice rewards motion early. Fast responses get noticed. Availability gets praised. The person who jumps in immediately looks reliable. Nobody pulls you aside in your first few years and says, hey, great job slowing down and thinking that through. Nobody celebrates restraint. Nobody compliments the email you didn't send yet. So you learn quickly that movement is safer than hesitation. Answering emails instantly feels responsible. Jumping into red lines feels helpful. Fixing something right away feels competent. And none of that's malicious. It's just what's visible. Busy is easy to measure. Direction isn't. So you start filling your days with activity, not because you're careless, but because you're trying to be useful. You're trying to show that you belong here, that you can handle it, that you're pulling your weight. And here's where the pattern starts to form. You begin focusing on the wrong part too early. You start solving before you fully understand the problem. You start to execute before intent is clear. And you start polishing things that haven't been oriented yet. Drawings before direction, responses before alignment, action before understanding are all technically correct, but they're all premature. And I want to stop here so I can say this strongly. There's a much bigger conversation about sequencing in practice, about how different types of people and thinking belong at different moments, but we're not doing that today. Today is just about noticing the moment where you start moving because it feels safer than stopping, because that moment shows up everywhere. You jump into red lines without fully understanding what the comment is that you're actually trying to resolve. You advance a layout because it's due, even though something about it still doesn't feel right. You respond to an email because it's easier than asking the clarifying question that might slow things down. And again, at the time, it all feels responsible. And that's the part that's hard to admit. A lot of busyness isn't driven by pressure, it's driven by uncertainty. When you're not fully oriented, motion feels like control, so you move. And I didn't understand this early on. Being busy can actually delay the judgment. If you stay in motion, you don't have to sit with the uncomfortable question of whether you're solving the right problem. You don't have to acknowledge that something might not be clear yet. You don't have to say, I actually don't know where this is going. You just keep going. And because the work keeps moving, nobody stops you. In fact, people thank you for it. The drawings advance, the inbox stays clean, and the day feels full. But then weeks later into the project, something starts to feel off. The project feels heavier than it should. Conversations are starting to get longer instead of more clear. And then decisions that were made early on get revisited, and the rework creeps in quietly. It's hard to point to a single mistake. That's because the issue wasn't a mistake, it was a misdirection. You focused on the wrong part too early. And this is what landed for me years into my career. Being busy kept me from noticing that I didn't know where I was going. Not because I wasn't smart enough, not because I didn't care, but because motion gave me false sense of certainty. At some point, people try to fix this with productivity, new tools, new systems, new workflows. And those can help, but only if the work itself is pointed in the right direction. Productivity doesn't create clarity, it optimizes whatever you're already doing, which means if you're executing prematurely, it just helps you execute prematurely faster. That's how you end up with very polished work based on shaky assumptions. And this is one of those moments where I need to slow down without fully unpacking it. And it's momentum is not neutral. Once work is in motion, assumptions harden. They don't get questioned, they get defended. Time gets invested and the effort piles up, and suddenly stopping feels expensive. So instead of realigning, people explain. They send more emails, they have more meetings, and then there's more documentation. We'll come back to that in the next episode. There's a lot there. But for now, we'll just notice how often increased communication is actually a signal that alignment never happened in the first place. Here's a little bit of relief because I know you need it. It's not about laziness and it's not about people not thinking enough. It's about how practice conditions behavior. Early on, availability gets mistaken for reliability. Speed gets mistaken for competence. And because nobody teaches you when to slow down, busyness becomes a default operating mode. You answer instead of thinking. You fix instead of clarifying. You absorb problems that aren't yours yet. And over time, that adds weight. Busyness has a cost that doesn't show up on timesheets. It creates rework, it hides missed signals, it turns small misalignments into structural ones. But it also hides something more personal: avoidance. When you're busy, you don't have to admit uncertainty. You don't have to say, I'm not sure yet. You don't have to pause long enough to feel exposed. The stillness is where judgment forms. And we talk about judgment a lot in this podcast. Stillness can feel risky, even when you're early or tired or trying to prove yourself. So you keep moving. You tell yourself you'll think later. But later rarely comes if you don't make room for it. And if you never stop moving, you never calibrate. And without calibration, experience doesn't turn into insight. It turns into exhaustion. So what does effective work actually look like? Because this is where the reframe happens. Effective work is quieter than people expect. From the outside, it can even look slow. It's the 10 minutes of thinking that avoids 10 hours of rework. It's the uncomfortable question asked early that prevents weeks of confusion. And it's letting a drawing sit overnight so you can actually see it clearly in the morning instead of after you've stared at it already for 8 hours. I've watched this play out more times than I can count. Two teams start with the same information. One team moves immediately. They respond to everything. They keep things moving. And from the outside, they look incredibly productive. The other team pauses. They ask questions that feel awkward at first. They clarify intent and they test assumptions. They slow the start. Now, for a while, the first team looks better, and then all the cracks start to show up. Revisions multiply. Conversations get longer, decisions get revisited. The work starts to feel heavy. The second team moves steadily. There's fewer surprises along the way. They have clearer conversations and there's less noise. Effective work doesn't announce itself, but it compounds. Here's a simple filter that I wish I had earlier on. Asking yourself, does this move the project forward or does it just move me? If it only creates motion, if it only fills time, if it only makes you feel productive in the moment, it might not be the highest value work in front of you. Busyness resets daily. Effectiveness builds over time. That's why effective practitioners often look calm, not because they care less, but because they're selective. They resist the urgency until urgency is earned. And yeah, that can feel risky, but over time, people notice. Problems shrink instead of multiply. Trust grows, and work lands better. This gets harder as you advance, not easier. Early on, being busy is normal. It's expected even, but later it becomes a liability. As responsibility grows, fewer tasks are assigned, but more judgment is expected. Leaders aren't valued for speed, they're valued for direction. They know when to move and when to pause. They protect the project from unnecessary motion. They notice when work is advancing without alignment and intervene early. Staying busy is how you see people plateau. They become excellent executors who never quite make the shift to decision makers. They carry more and more, but influence less and less. Direction requires the restraint, and restraint requires being willing to slow down long enough to ask, what are we actually doing here? And that's not something you're handed. It's something you have to practice. So again, busy isn't the problem. Being busy once felt like competence to me until I realized I was keeping me from developing judgment. I wasn't overwhelmed by work. I was overwhelmed because I started moving before I was oriented. If this episode felt uncomfortably familiar, that's a good sign. It means you've started to notice the difference between motion and direction. We didn't solve anything today. That wasn't the point. We just named a pattern. Because once you start moving before you're aligned, the next thing that breaks isn't effort, it's communication. And that's where we're going to go next. The practice of architecture isn't intuitive, but it is learnable. So don't worry. We'll keep building from here. This podcast only works if it gets passed along. Not because of me, but because the hardest parts of practice are usually learned in isolation. If this episode put words to something you've been struggling with, share it with someone earlier in practice or leave a comment naming the moment that hit. I'm doing this because I remember how long it took to realize that I wasn't behind. I just wasn't being taught. Most of what feels like a personal failure in this profession is actually a shared pattern. The more we name those patterns, the faster we all get better. I'll see you in the next one.